The proceeding is currently in private.
Thank you. Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Committee evidence session on the work of the Financial Conduct Authority. Can I invite our witnesses to introduce themselves? Nikhil.
Good afternoon. I'm Lloyd. I'm the interim chair of the Financial Conduct Authority.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Nikhil Rati, Chief Executive of the Financial Conduct Authority.
Great. Well, thank you very much. As you know, we've had a reshuffle and a new Prime Minister, so we're awaiting our new chair to be elected. And in the meantime, you've got me as your interim chair. So the government has said that it intends to amend the current bill to give the Treasury the power to direct regulators to make and remove rules where there is a significant public interest. Can each of you tell us what you think of that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we've supported many of the proposals in the future regulatory framework that are in the bill. Obviously, there's a lot of extra powers that are coming our way with retained EU law coming onto our rulebook. The proposals that the Treasury consulted on for more scrutiny, more consultation, more accountability seem to us to be right. If we're going to be given extra responsibilities, then our accountability needs to be clear. What the Treasury didn't consult on was, in fact, ruled out when it consulted, was a power to direct the regulators. And I would simply say this, that our international reputation and indeed our competitiveness in financial services internationally, our reputation is in part built very clearly on the perception, the reality of the independence of regulators, of our set by Parliament, our very clear objectives, our practice of consulting and engaging and making measured rules based on the evidence. And I think that just the reality will be, if Parliament does, and we haven't seen the amendment that the Minister spoke of at committee stage.
You haven't seen it?
We haven't seen it.
Have you had any discussions with the government about it?
We've had very many discussions about both the perception and the reality of that sort of measure being introduced.
Sounds like they didn't pay much attention to what you had to say.
Even if it's used very sparingly, and again, it depends how it's bounded, what the safeguards are, what the commitments to Parliament are about how infrequently it might be used. The perception that comes with the ability of ministers to direct independent regulators clearly will go to undermining our independence, and we're very clear, we have been very clear with ministers, that is of great concern to us.
Thank you. Nikhil Rati.
Thank you, Chair. As Richard said, we supported the bill as introduced, and we've been working intensively to make sure we are responsive to the accountability requirements that are set out there, and we very much welcome this committee's decision to establish a subcommittee on financial regulation supported by expert advisors, and very much want to engage with that committee and support you in your scrutiny. Richard emphasised the point around operational independence, and I'd say that doesn't mean we operate in a vacuum. I think we've demonstrated, particularly over the last couple of years, that we really understand the public policy environment that we're operating in. During the pandemic, responding as rapidly and as decisively as we needed to support consumers and businesses through. In the Russia-Ukraine situation, working very hard with the government and with partners to implement the sanctions regime. It's worth noting that the FCA for many years now has been making rules around consumer protection, listing rules and so on. And that's operated without such a power in place, and I'm not aware of any example where there has been an issue with how the rules have been made, and no example has been provided to me. Should such a power come in, I think the role of Parliament is going to be incredibly important. What is the parliamentary oversight of this? Is it a power that simply calls in the rule but doesn't require Parliament to vote on the actual text of what is going to be substituted? Is there going to be an impact assessment? How do we express our view to Parliament about what the proposed new regulation may entail in terms of the risks? how do we articulate what the operational issues for us may be if a particular rule comes into force, and how it might interconnect with other bits of our rule book. And then there are some areas which really go to the fabric of our institutional framework in the United Kingdom. So, for example, in the area of enforcement, it really would be a very big departure from any established practice for there to be political rulemaking in relation to enforcement. There are very good reasons why enforcement has been kept very separate once the overall framework is set by Parliament. And likewise on listing rules, I'm not aware of any other major developed jurisdiction that would have a power such as this.
So just on that term, political rulemaking, we had a minister, Minister Griffiths, who came here. He couldn't explain or define what public interest actually meant. That doesn't inspire confidence. And what you're saying, the term political rulemaking, certainly, loaded in those two words is interference with the regulatory independence of the FCA. Isn't that the case?
Obviously, we continually discuss with ministers, and we have a remit letter that sets out the government's view and what it's trying to achieve with economic policy and how the FCA can help support that. So it's not unusual, as Nikhil says.
No, but my question was about the term political, political rule making.
Well, I think outside Parliament makes the legislative framework that we operate. I mean,
essentially, the upshot of what you're saying is this new call-in power is going to affect your independence. It's going to compromise the independence of the regulator, right?
Well, I think, again, it remains to be seen what it exactly looks like and how it might be bounded. But that will be the impression in the marketplace. That's already what we're hearing from our statutory panels, from players in the market and consumer groups.
Okay.
And that is how it will be seen internationally as well.
To both of you, Sir John Cunliffe said that I understand the point about the public interest test. I would only observe that, of course, we exist in the public interest. Everything we do in the regulatory sphere is in the public interest. We have no other reason to do it. The public interests are balanced in the legislation. As the FCA board chair, do you feel that you are regularly acting against the public interest?
No, I certainly hope not. And everything we do.
So why do you think there's a need for the government to come in to introduce something called the public interest that ministers?
That's a question for ministers. But I think the purpose of having an independent regulator with a board chaired by an independent person with no political affiliation, who ensures that the decisions that we make, and that is reserved to the FCA board to make rules and to approve our guidance, as well as to oversee our operational effectiveness. Okay. That's our purpose, and our purpose is there, and we are all appointed to act in the public interest.
So, Nikhil Rathi, is there a reason why the government thinks it needs this call-in power to ensure public interest is protected? Are you acting against the public interest as the chief executive of the FCA? Should we be worried? I mean, why do you think this is happening?
I believe everything that we do at the FCA is in furtherance of our objectives in the public interest. Those objectives are set out in the legislation in relation to consumer protection, market integrity, competition in the interests of consumers. The argument I have heard in relation to this power is the need to bolster democratic accountability. Obviously, this committee and Parliament will be the judge of what is appropriate and needed for democratic accountability. We will certainly play our full part, as I said earlier, in making sure this committee and the committees in the other place are able to undertake scrutiny of our work. We recognise the need for us to show more of our working, improve transparency, and explain what we're doing as further powers come our way. And we also recognise that at any point the government and Parliament of the day can introduce legislation to make changes to specific rules should they wish to do so. That's happened in the past, for example, with respect to ring fencing, where Parliament took a very close interest in that. But that's done through a legislative process where everybody then can articulate their views and Parliament can make a decision on the rules.
And so if you pointed to the role of this committee, which has strongly supported the FCA's operational independence. Is that lost in your view the moment this power is used for the first time?
I think the perception of the erosion of our independence will happen very rapidly, and the concern that we've already heard from the market, from other stakeholders, and internationally, for example, from the IMF, is that will be the case once that measure, if it gets passed by Parliament, moves into law.
So what we've seen during the mini budget fiasco is a government acting without, in a way that didn't respect the independence of institutions like the OBR, didn't take into account their the part they can play, and we saw what happened. What you're telling us is that actually a number of institutions, including your own, is raising alarm bells. What do you think the knock-on effect and damage in terms of the impact on financial services will be, and wider society would be, if this power is applied in the way that the government is planning to? What are the real impacts? You mentioned confidence, you mentioned obviously the kind of concerns around the international community and IMF and others. What does it mean in real terms for our citizens?
Well, I think first of all our reputation as a country that's the best, in my view, in the world in which to do financial services business, that is clearly something we want to protect, and if part of that reputation is built on the independence and effectiveness of our regulators, and in my view it is, then clearly there is a risk there in terms of the competitiveness internationally of our market.
Is there? Could you imagine a situation where there could be a risk to financial stability, as we saw with the budget and the way that was announced, and the way that the OBR was left out of the equation and so on? Could you imagine a situation like that? Situation in terms of stability, financial stability risks?
I don't want to speculate about what may or may not happen with an amendment that we haven't seen yet, but I would say that clearly at the moment markets are very volatile.
Yeah.
The actions of the government and Parliament are being watched very closely. And in our view, at times like this, what's needed is stability, evidence-based rulemaking, consistency, accountability, and as much as possible, in particular in a time when we are introducing new powers to the regulators, including the FCA, a clear plan for how that will happen.
Yep.
And doing that in a planned and as unrisky a way as possible. And that's the lesson.
The other point, if I may add, is there is a very clear framework articulated in the bill as introduced around how rules should be made, around how impact assessments should be done, cost benefits analysis should be done, consultation processes and then implementation processes. One of the objectives we are seeking to pursue is being able to be more agile, being able to act faster in making these rules. Inevitably, the nature of the work we do, and you hear from different interests in the committee, when we make rules, nearly always there is a constituency that is unhappy with our decision, because we're seeking to balance many different interests. If you then have a situation where the unhappy constituency then seeks to approach ministers to get our rules overturned, the certainty for all parties, market participants, consumers, is then eroded, because at some point you have to be able to get on and implement the decisions that have been taken, the decisions for which we are accountable to you very clearly.
So basically the upshot is it's going to compromise independence, it's going to put you in a difficult position to be able to exercise your powers appropriately. It's going to potentially risk the objectivity in the process. And in the current climate, with the mini budget fiasco and the consequences, it's important not to unsettle markets and rock the boat. Would that be a good summary?
Well, I'll just emphasise the last bit of that, which is there is a backdrop here, clearly economic and market volatility, where it would be unwise to create a perception that rules will be made by future ministers, potentially overriding the evidence-based decision-making of the FCA board.
Well, I hope the Chancellor and his ministers are taking note of what you're saying, and will certainly feed these points through. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Siobhan MacDonald.
Can I just come in very quickly?